Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Science Friday Book Club live stream. It is so nice to see you all here. My name is Diana. I am the Experiences Manager for Science Friday, which basically means anytime we do a gathering like this, it's usually me somehow behind the scenes or sometimes hosting. So I'm so excited to chat with you all tonight. I'm joining you from formerly sunny Brooklyn, New York. Thank you again so much for joining us. A bunch of people in the chat are letting us know where they are from. So if you want to go over to the chat and let us know, we've got people from Maryland, Indiana, Pennsylvania, California, Connecticut, Wisconsin. I see even someone from Japan. So nice to see everyone here. So you can go over to the chat and let us know. If you are signed into a YouTube account, that is the way that you can actually join us in the chat. So usually it's just a Google account. So if you have Gmail, you can sign right in and join us in the chat for later when we will be taking questions. Well, if you don't know Science Friday, we are your one-stop shop for all things science news. We're well known for our weekly science radio broadcast every week on, you guessed it, Friday with founder and host Ira Flato. You can listen to us live at 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern on your radio station or by listening to us at sciencefriday.com and clicking the listen banner at the top of our page. And that'll be live tomorrow. But you can also listen to podcasts from over 30 years of our history. So it's all at sciencefriday.com. Today, though, we are gathering as a part of our monthly read. We have a Science Friday book club, and this month we read a nonfiction book about neuroscience, grief, and love called The Grieving Brain, The Surprising Science of How We Learn from Love and Loss by Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor. And if you want to join your fellow readers and discuss our book club reads every month, there's a great way to do that. You can just go to sciencefriday.com/book club. We've got everything that you could possibly need, including a community space that you can join, actually. And I'm going to put a link for that in our chat. So you can go ahead and join our community space. It's kind of like Facebook groups, but it's better because it is not on Facebook. Anyway, tonight is really special because we actually have the author here to talk about her book. But one special note before we get started. We are going to be talking about death, grief, and what happens in our brains through the bereavement process. We do have limited time for questions, so we encourage you to try your best to focus and simplify your question as best you can. I'm going to be actually going through the chat and finding your questions throughout, and so it will help me a lot if your questions are as concise and directed as you can possibly get them. So thank you in advance for doing that, and I can't wait to get to your questions because they are always better than the questions that I write. So a friendly reminder to everyone before we get started. So Science Friday is committed to providing a welcoming and harassment-free environment for members of all ethnicities, ages, gender, and trans statuses, sexual orientations, physical abilities, national origin, beliefs, and any other dimension of diversity. We have created a code of conduct, which you can read in its entirety on our community space to help us create a safe and positive community experience for all. And we believe that providing clear expectations is a necessary part of building a respectful community. Here are the basics. Be supportive and respectful when engaging in the chat and anywhere on our community space tonight. Share generously and listen closely. You can add thoughts throughout, even if they aren't strictly questions for our guest. Stay on topic as we're here to discuss this month's book club read, The Grieving Brain, and related topics. We reserve the right to ban anyone who engages in demeaning, discriminatory, or harassing behavior in the chat today. And you might notice that many people will mention their personal experience with grief and or the death of a loved one or express deep emotion about that experience in the chat. That's okay. While our guests might not be able to answer direct personal questions about your experience, we understand that these experiences are real, and we hope that your engagement with tonight's conversation around neuroscience and grief may offer a new or fresh perspective on the topic. Well, I have been introducing our guests for quite some time, and so now it is time to bring them onto stage with me. So please welcome our very special guest. Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor is a neuroscientist, grief researcher, and the author of The Grieving Brain, The Surprising Science of How We Learn from Love and Loss, which is the Science Friday Book Club pick for this month. She is based in Tucson, Arizona. Welcome, Mary Frances.
It's so lovely to be here, Diana.
Thank you so much for being here tonight. It is always just such a pleasure to talk to our authors, and tonight will be no exception. So A kind reminder to our audience, throughout this experience, we want your questions. You can put them in the chat literally anytime as you think of one, or as we get to a topic that is of particular interest to you. Just put it on in the chat and we will try to get to as many audience questions as we possibly can tonight. All right, so I have described a little bit about your work, but it's always better for the person who we are talking to today to describe it for themselves. So can you just tell us a little bit about what it is that you do?
Well, neuroscience is definitely not the first thing that most people think of when
Mhm,
they think about grief and
mhm,
grieving. So sometimes it's a little surprising to people that this is the lens through which I look at this experience. But I
mhm,
think that my, neuroimaging studies that I've done and talking with hundreds of participants in research studies now who are bereaved, I feel like looking into the brain and how the brain understands these relationships that we have, and then how it comes to understand when that person is gone, can give us some insights into the why and the how of grief and grieving. And I think that's very useful for a lot of people.
mm,
But I would say also, it isn't only an academic topic for me. So I often mention this just because I think it's helpful to know if the person who's studying this has actually experienced grief as well. And I haven't had worse grief than anyone else, but when I was 13, my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. And it was stage 4, so they knew it had already traveled to other parts of her body,
mm.
and she amazingly lived another 13 years, which just was like a reprieve from the universe for my sister and I. But it meant that I became really familiar with grief, that I really became comfortable with people who were grieving. And so I think that's probably wrapping my empathy and listening to people and what they're talking about when they're talking about grief, and mapping that on to these neuroimages is hopefully been useful in then writing a book in a general conversational way, so that people can use that information if they find it interesting for themselves.
Was there a particular moment that you thought, oh, this means I really need to write a book about neuroscience and grief and the intersection of the two? Or was it sort of a slow build?
It really was a slow build. I think I often have conversations on airplanes. The
Hmm,
person next to
hmm.
you says, "Oh, what do you do?" And I occasionally say, "I'm a psychologist."
Yep. So
Sometimes I don't.
I was going to say, does that often shut down the conversation or does that
It
maybe
kind of
start up?
depends.
Yeah.
Sometimes I say I'm a neuroscientist.
Hmm.
Uh, But most importantly, what I realized was that every day I am deep, into these research studies about grief, and conducting my own studies. And what I really came to realize was what I just said a moment ago. It became clear to me that people weren't getting this information, that we actually knew more about grief and grieving than people were able to use. And so to me, it felt like a way to communicate directly with people, to sort of tell them what some of the information is, but then maybe also why it would matter, or how it was relevant in my own life, as a way that they might then be able to think of their own experience through that lens.
Hmm. You talk a lot in your book about flexibility, about mental flexibility and situational flexibility. And I found that that was one of the most interesting and surprising things about the book. I wasn't expecting necessarily, you know, I think I was expecting a lot of like, here's what neurons are doing. And you do some of that, but it's a lot more about here is sort of what helps your brain, and here's places your brain goes that maybe puts the grief process into something more of a recursive feeling for the person going through it. Why was it important for you to talk a lot about flexibility?
You know, as researcher, as a scientist, we have been studying grief for a while. Many people know the 5 stages of grief by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And of course, those came out in 1969. Think how far science has come since 1969.
Yeah.
And, she was a remarkable woman, a psychiatrist at a time when there weren't a lot of women in psychiatry. And she really was describing what people were telling her that they were experiencing, first with terminal illness and then with grief. Um, and so they were talking about feeling depression, feeling denial, feeling anger. And we still know that those are all a part of the experience of grief. But her work came to be used as though there's this really linear path, right? You do this stage, and then you do this stage, and
Like a
and then you're
recipe. It's like
yeah,
you do it
like,
this
and then you're
way.
done, right?
Yeah.
And nobody has that experience.
Mhm,
And
mhm,
so what we came to realize was there's a lot of individual variability when it comes to grief and grieving. There's a lot of experiences that people have beyond those 5 experiences. And most importantly, that the way that we cope with those moments of grief or facing a future without a person who is so dear to us, flexibility really is the key. So that is to say, there's not one way of coping that is better than all the other ways of coping. But rather, what matters is what's useful in the moment. And
mm,
so I'll give you an example where, denial gets a bad rap. We
yeah,
think, oh, that's terrible. Someone shouldn't do that. They won't ever get through their grief if they use denial. I think that it's not that straightforward. Denial is one of the tools that we can use. So, if you're at your daughter's soccer game, you may think, you know what? For the next 45 minutes, I am going to pretend that her father has not died. I'm not going to think about that at all. I am focused solely on cheering for her and being engaged in the game. And that's a great use of denial. There's nothing wrong with that.
mhm,
Now, the trouble is, if that's the same tool you use every day,
mhm.
in the long run, you're probably not going to get any easier at dealing with these strong feelings that come with grief. And so it really has to be a big toolkit so that there's lots of things that you might try when you're feeling grief.
Yeah. We've got some really great questions in the chat, so I'm going to go to one of them here. One of the things I found really interesting about your book is that you sort of, you're really zoned in, of course, on your expertise, the sort of intersection of neuroscience and grief. But you do sort of hop to some other topics and sort of, give them credence and also say like, this is not my expertise and it's not what this book is about, but there is something there. You mention people's connection with religion and like this is my book is not meant to be instead of that. It is
Yeah.
another, like you said, a tool in a toolbox. And so Mary has a question which says, can grief lead to physical ailments? So
Yeah.
I don't think you talk too much about this in your book, but have you found any sort of research that sort of talks a little bit about that?
So you may be surprised to find out that I'm only half a neuroscientist, which
Hmm.
is to say that half of my research is about the brain, but half of my research is actually about the body and what
Mm-hmm.
happens medically to us when we have that incredible stressor.
Mm-hmm.
And so people may be excited to learn that I'm currently working on a book called The Grieving Body.
Ah.
That is to say, I'll give you the cliff notes right now. Um, the truth is that grief does affect us physically as well as emotionally and mentally. And what we know from really many, many years of research and very large study, literally millions of people, is that there's something called the broken heart phenomenon. That, for example, when a man has experienced the death of his wife in the first 6 months, he is almost twice as likely to die than a married man, a similar man who remains married through that time. And that is an enormous risk compared to what we think of as, important risk factors for our health. That's a very large number. Of course, that number gets smaller when you include a lot of covariates or a lot of other
Mhm.
risks that people might have. And the risk is high for women as well, although not as high. And so we know for sure that it's impacting our health. Mortality is a really clear outcome. But more recent research and research from my own lab has really looked at, well, what could be the mechanism here? And so I've investigated things like blood pressure that often
Mhm.
rises in people when they've experienced a loss, inflammation often increases in folks who've experienced a loss. And for the vast majority of us, those go back to normal. We learn to regulate our physiology without this person after a period of time. But that is an increased risk. And so the primary thing that I think is important for people to think about is these are typical, hypertension is just a run of the mill kind of problem that people have. Bereavement is a time to go see your doctor for your annual checkup.
Mm.
Often, when we've been caring for a loved one who is dying, we've neglected our own care for obvious reasons.
Mhm.
But now is the time to go get your mammogram, your colonoscopy, your dental exam. It's now time to focus in on your own health because we know it's a time of increased risk, and that most of what people experience will be caught on a normal blood pressure test in the doctor's office.
Yeah. So it's almost like there's sort of a double-edged sword here. It's both grief itself and also the sort of like not quite aftermath, but
Yeah,
the next steps, what you do with your life after. It's like you're
yeah,
less likely to take care of yourself. It's really
yeah,
interesting. Yeah,
yeah,
it also probably makes a lot of sense to a lot of people who've
yeah.
recently experienced grief. That was a great question. Thank you so much, Mary. Um, we have another question here that I find really intriguing. Victoria asks, during a period of 5 years, her mother, father, dad, a husband, and aunt passed away. That period of time is a blank in my memory. I coped and worked, and I guess I seemed normal. Was I on autopilot? I'm sure you hear this story a lot from people who are
Yeah,
you're researching.
yeah. You know, I think one of the things that we forget is that life also goes on while we are grieving. And for many of us, there are a lot of secondary stresses that happen when we have lost a loved one. So we
Mhm.
may have lost a wage earner in our family, or we may have lost the person who drives us. If you're an older adult and you lose your spouse, they may be the person who's always driven you.
Mhm.
Um, and so when you think about it this way, there's a lot of things to be coping with, not only the feeling specifically about the loss. And so, depending on what's on your plate, sometimes just getting through the day is a way that people cope
Mhm.
without necessarily processing a lot of feelings and feeling numb in a way that means they're also not necessarily encoding a lot of what's going on around them.
Hmm.
It's not common for it to last as long as 5 years. Most people experience this for, a few weeks, a few months, and then on and off, right? It doesn't just turn off one day.
Mhm.
But what's important is that being able to cope is so critical, right? Keeping going is an important part of what happens during grief while your body and your brain are trying to figure out what is this new reality that I'm in. Often our brain is doing a lot of work in the background. I describe it as, have you ever had something updating on your computer in the background and you're like trying to type a Word document and the letters are like really slow and then
Yeah.
there's a bunch of it's a little bit like that. You're
Yeah.
focused on whatever you're trying to do, make your grocery list or whatever. But there's all this stuff going on in the background that is your brain trying to adapt to your current reality. And so it can make it very difficult to concentrate, difficult to encode what's going on around you, which then makes it hard to remember what's
Mhm.
happened. So that part can be quite normal for people initially.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You're very good with metaphors. Did that come slowly, or was that as you were talking about your work and your book that you sort of picked up on the ones that worked really well or helped people connect to these concepts?
Metaphors sort of comes from two places. One is I'm a teacher.
Mhm.
And so metaphors are a great way to help my students to understand through, say, a visual example or something that's just very everyday as a way to understand things that are sometimes pretty complicated in neuroscience. And so metaphors I already knew were helpful in that setting. And I actually studied a lot about science communication. I wanted to make sure that I didn't make the same mistakes that some scientists make when they're trying to explain their work and it doesn't really come across. And so, one of the things that I learned is a really concrete metaphor can be very useful for the person who's listening to try and connect to what you're saying or even to hear what you're saying in a different way. And so, I think that science communication, fortunately, is something that more and more scientists are taking really seriously. It is its own set of skills.
Mhm.
And so it doesn't happen automatically. It takes
Yeah.
effort on our part. It's not the natural way necessarily that we talk with each other. And so that became an important way of bringing across the information that we know in a way that might be useful.
Yeah, I was just sent a new book all about not just science communication, but science communication during a crisis. So
Oh, yes,
another hugely important element. So
absolutely.
it's amazing. We've got some similar questions so I'm going to highlight sort of one at a time, but I think they're related. We have this question that reads, does your research say anything about grieving in divorce or abuse relationships? Um, I'm thinking in particular of this study that you mentioned about the difference during homesickness, a breakup, and grieving the death of a loved one. Can you tell us a little bit about how those kinds of compare, or if what this commenter is mentioning here, if that comes up in grief research as well?
You have read the book really closely, Diana. I can't believe you remember that study.
That one really
So
intrigued me. I
apparently it stuck with you. That's
yeah,
great.
yeah.
So I think it's helpful to think about grief in this way. You can't really talk about grief without talking about love, right? Because it's the bond that happens first.
Mhm.
And then when that bond is broken, we have this reaction, right? So we've become an us, right? We're not just you and me, we're now an us. And so breaking that bond through separation means that we automatically have a reaction to that, an emotional, often very painful reaction. So you can think about the idea that that bond can get broken for lots of reasons, right? So one of them is bereavement, and that's maybe sort of the clearest example of a bond that's kind of permanently broken. But there are lots of other reasons that relationships get broken, and that can be through divorce, that can be through your kids moving away from home. Best friends can, end up drifting apart. So there are lots of reasons that that bond can get broken. And what we see is that the brain recognizes this is grief, right? This feels like grief because of that reaction.
Mm.
But I would add that there's actually other kinds of grief as well, where it's not a person necessarily that you've lost. And I think it can be easiest to think about it this way. So we start with a person. So, for example, I would describe myself as a daughter, right? That's a word that describes me, myself. But the word daughter actually implies two people, doesn't it? The word parent describes two people, spouse, even best friend, right? Colleague. They actually describe multiple people, even though it's about you. You're
Mm.
using it to describe yourself. And so, what we think about is the fact that when a relationship ends, when a person dies, that part of yourself has to change, is gone. And so then you can think about the idea that, let's say I were to retire, right? Being a professor is a big part of my identity. And so I would feel a lot of grief over that loss of a part of myself. So while I think that we may have really evolved to understand grief when relationships break,
Mm.
but I think we can see the similarity of feeling then when we're homesick or when we have loss of health or loss of function, right? Eyesight or hearing. And so I think that's why they might feel similar. They also are going to feel different, of course. So in divorce, as an example, we have a much greater sense often of shame that it was my fault in the way that is not true in bereavement, or blame in that it was their fault in the way that it is often not in bereavement. So there are, of course, differences, but there's a lot of similarity as well.
Yeah. Um, I So near the end of your book, you make this distinction between giving advice about personal grief experiences and exposing or teaching about grief in general and on average.
Mhm.
Can you tell us why it was important for you to make that distinction?
You know, I don't actually think that advice is necessarily useful.
Mm,
And that's because our experiences of grief are so individual. So I may be an expert on grief and I can tell you on average what happens, right? I can survey many people and tell you on average, what does the trajectory of grief look like? How do people who are not adapting very well, who might have prolonged grief, how does that look different from more resilient, more common, typical grief? Um, but all of that means, yes, I'm an expert on grief, but you're the expert on you, right? And so I sometimes think about this in terms of, I think of it as lending you my glasses,
hmm,
right? So I can lend you my glasses so that you might see the world through my eyes for briefly, and that might bring things into focus that you hadn't thought of before that could be helpful. That's not the same as advice, though, right?
mhm.
And then you may also realize that some of the things that you hear don't actually work for you. They don't make any sense for you. They don't resonate. And that's okay too.
I love that. Yeah, I really enjoyed that your book kind of ended with saying, like, here's the things I think we've learned together. Me by writing this book, hopefully by reading it. I'm very appreciative of that because sometimes I do get to the end of, especially books on topics that are really new to readers that don't do that. And I get to the end and I'm like, what did I learn? I'm
Mhm.
not sure. And it's great to have a chapter that's like, here's all the things we learned. So if you haven't read The Grieving Brain, that's something to look forward to, readers. Um, we've got some really great questions. I'm going to get back to some of the ones in the chat. We've got two sort of back to back that
Mhm.
relate to each other. So I'm going to ask John's first and then go to Christine's. So John writes, I have a friend who's still grieving his wife after 8+ years. Is grieving a lifelong phenomena or is there an end to grief? And then Christine, as sort of a response, had said, I know one doesn't get over a loss, but is it possible to be stuck in deep grief to a point of dysfunction? If so, what are steps that might help?
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
talk a little bit about
Yeah.
that.
I think that a really useful distinction here is a distinction that I made that I learned because of doing the studies, but is the difference between grief and grieving.
Mm,
So, in regular conversation, of course, we use those words interchangeably. But here's the difference, I think. So grief is that feeling, that just overwhelming wave often, that we experience. And it's the natural response to being aware that someone so important to us is gone.
hmm
It is a natural human reaction. Grieving, on the other hand, is the way that grief changes over time, right? So for most of us, there is we have fewer waves of grief as time passes, or they're less intense, or even if they feel exactly the same, they become more familiar,
mm,
right? We may learn how to comfort ourselves in those moments. And so what we expect, what is the typical thing, is that people will still have grief, these moments forever.
hmm
This is sort of a silly example, but um, my dad died about 7 years ago. And when I go into Trader Joe's around Christmas and the Joe's O's come out that are the peppermint with chocolate,
mm,
it doesn't matter that it's been 7 years. I'm there in the grocery store, all welled up because my dad and I used to eat a ton of these. And I think I can't do that with him this year. The fact that I have pretty intense grief sometimes in that moment doesn't mean there's anything wrong with my grieving. It doesn't mean that I've been avoiding or in denial or I haven't done my grief work or whatever. It just means that grief is a natural reaction and we're going to have that because the person has died for forever or for a very long time. But it won't be as common. It won't be as often. It may not be as intense, or we just know how to handle it a
hmm
little better. And so I think what's useful about that then is that then we can start to make a distinction between folks who don't experience any change over time.
Mhm.
So what we can see in empirical studies where we follow people, month after month for many years is that, or at least a couple of years, is that over that first year, most of us experience, it's not linear. So you have worse days and then you have better days and then you have worse days and then the anniversary is terrible. But in general, people are experiencing a change over time where the grief is less frequent or less intense. But there is a group of people who they look the same. Their level of grief is just like it was when the person died. And that, of course, as a clinician and as a friend or family member, those are the people that we're really concerned about, right? What is notable is that in that first year, depending on who walks into my lab, I can't tell which trajectory they're on. Everyone is having a tough time. And so at about a year, you start to see that the lines separate so that the people who are experiencing the typical grief, you can sort of start to see that they look different from the group who's not showing any change. And that predicts for the group who's not showing any change that they're not likely to show any change into the future either. Now, notice that just because the grief is decreasing, it doesn't mean it's gone away, right, for the other people. So it's not saying that at a year, people don't have grief anymore. I think of it as there are then reasons often that grief remains elevated for this group of people who have what we would call prolonged grief. And what we know from randomized clinical trials is that targeted psychotherapy can really help get them back on that more natural trajectory, which is wonderful. And this can be true even if it's years after there's been a loss. But I think the last sort of thought I would leave you with is, people sometimes, we're really, as a culture, we really want grief to be over someday, right? We really, really, really want there to be an end. And so sometimes I use this phrase that I think can be helpful. I'll ask, well, when did you get over your wedding? Right?
Yeah,
That's
it
not a
sounds
question
silly.
that doesn't make any sense,
Yeah.
right? And so similarly, when you say, when do you get over the death of a loved one? That's an event that changes you. It changes your life. It changes the way you see life. That is going to be true, even if the waves of grief are different than they were at the beginning.
That is your use of metaphor in relations to the rest of sort of how we experience our world, um, spot on. We also in our community space, I had asked a question. We have weekly questions that I ask people to sort of like engage them with parts of the book, and I had asked a question about mental flexibility, and someone had mentioned, in addition to flexibility, what I find so interesting is this idea that, our brains are forever changed because of our relationship to our loved ones. And you say in the book that essentially, even if they and their bodies and their minds are gone and they're no longer with us, they still live on in our brains because they have literally physically changed us,
Yeah.
physically, mentally, emotionally changed us. And I
Yeah.
think that really resonated with people.
Yeah.
Um, do you find that if you say that to people that you're talking to about grief, that changes their perspective of the experience or of
Yeah.
the idea?
Yeah, it really can. I mean, we literally know that, there's these little rodents called voles, these cute little rodents that are apparently not very friendly to humans, but they pair bond for life is the thing that's fascinating about them. So they will prefer their own, their one and only vole to any other vole for the rest of their lives. And they spend all this time huddling together. What's interesting is we can actually see that when that bond happens, the proteins are folded differently in the brain, in a very specific region of the brain when they have bonded,
Mm.
right? So, and it's not just with any vole, it's this vole, this specific vole. And I think that idea that my brain is physically different because I was loved and because I loved them. And I'm going to carry that forever. And because it's a part of my brain, it also means that I can continue to talk to this person. I can call on my dad for advice and I know what he would say to me, right? And so the idea that they are physically a part of us, even when they're physically absent in the external world, many people find very comforting. I know I do.
We've got a great question again from our audience member, Claudia, who says, do you see cultural differences in how grief is expressed and viewed by others?
Yeah. This is such an interesting question. So, what we know is that the experience of grief is universal. So, we see that across all periods of history, across all cultures, men, women, children. We even see it in some other species, right? So, in species where there's very social mammals, especially large mammals that care for their young for a long time, like elephants and whales, we see behavior that looks very much like grief.
Mm,
So the experience of grief is very universal, but the expression of that grief is widely variable,
mm,
widely variable. So the way that a culture has chosen to express that experience, is shaped when we're kids, right? We go to a funeral and our experience is shaped by what we see the adults doing.
mhm,
Maybe in our family, what we saw happening, what we see, in television and so forth. And so things that look really bizarre in one culture or one period of history look totally normal in another. Here's a really simple example. In the Victorian era, when photography first became available to people, they would take photographs of the person who had died after they had died, and often with the family members. So, holding a child who had died, for
mhm.
example, or being next to a husband who had died. And these photographs were then displayed in the home. Now, for most of us, the idea of walking into someone's living room and seeing a photograph of their deceased relative sounds incredibly morbid. But this was their way of connecting, of remaining connected with this person. So we see really wide differences in how much people emote, how much they hold that into themselves, choose not to, in some cultures, burden others with their grief. What's most interesting to me is that it doesn't seem to matter the way that it gets expressed. That in different cultures, it isn't that one culture deals better or worse with grief.
Mm,
Most of us are resilient. But what does often matter is if your way of expressing grief does not fit with your culture's expectation,
interesting.
that mismatch can actually cause a lot of difficulty. Many people will experience this even in their family. So, the man whose baby has died, who's not expressing a lot of grief, his wife may think, did he not love our child? But the way we express is actually very, very different. And he may be motivated to try and sort of be strong and, focus on taking care of things so that she can, have some space. Um, and so you can see that it isn't necessarily that there's a good way or a bad way to grieve, but that when we infer what the motivation is, and
Mm,
often when we infer that they aren't grieving or they're not grieving right,
mm.
that it's actually that disconnect that makes grieving people feel even more isolated and alone.
Yeah, I can imagine. We've got another really great question. Yolanda asks, is sudden, unexpected loss of a loved one versus anticipated loss does that cause different types or depth of grief? I also think a question that I have sort of in addition to this is that easy to study? Because it seems
Mhm.
like as a scientist, um, you have to do these sort of expansive research studies that maybe you don't know what's going to happen to people, and that's a real research problem.
Yeah. So we do know that expectedness matters.
Mm.
So I say it that way. I've been doing research during the pandemic, for example, interviewing people by phone who lost someone during the pandemic. And of course, there were lots of differences during that time, both in terms of not being able to be at the bedside when they were in a hospital or long-term care, not having funerals, all these other things. What we knew from research before the pandemic was that an unexpected death often triggers a very severe reaction, right? The brain is a prediction machine. It likes to know what's going to happen, and it tries to use past experience to sort of help us prepare for what might come next. Unexpected deaths really, really are hard for the brain to understand what is happening. And so, what we found in that research was that actually expectedness mattered more than whether the person died of COVID or something else, whether they died at home or in a hospital. It was if the death was unexpected, that was what created the most severe acute grief. So that has always been true. Of course, the difference was the sheer number of deaths, and the number of unexpected deaths during the pandemic was much higher. But to your point, then, well, I should say there's a bit of a flip side. So when we think about why is a death that you can anticipate, where the person maybe has been terminally ill for a while, in what way would that be helpful in grieving, is often that we had a chance to have a closure conversation. We had a chance to say, I love you and thank you and I forgive you, or please forgive me, and to say goodbye. And when we're grieving, having a memory of having been able to do that can be very comforting to people. So that is why we think, for one reason, that that being able to anticipate can be useful. But there is a sort of a caveat here, which is when people have been caregiving for a very long time, so a spouse or an adult daughter who's been taking care of someone with dementia or some other sort of debilitating illness, that caregiving is exhausting. And so we do sometimes see that caregivers have difficulty with grieving because they are already so depleted when the death happens
Mm.
that it makes everything harder. Often their social circle has shrunk a lot, and we know social support is so important in grieving. And so that's another. So there's that little bit of a caveat, but that is generally what we think of as the answer to that. Now, you asked a follow-up question. I'm not sure I answered.
No, it's okay. Yeah, my follow-up question was just about how difficult this can be to study. You had
Oh, yes.
Yeah, you had talked in your book too about these, like the importance of these long-term studies that might not actually have to do with what someone is necessarily researching, but that kind of by accident they happen to research something else. And so you talk a little bit about that in your book as well. This other research also happened to kind of follow people for several years, over which time one of the spouses had died. And so it was actually also a way to study grief after long-term partnership. So,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
yeah, like what are some of the challenges of studying grief besides
Yeah,
how burdensome I'm sure it can be at
yeah.
times.
I mean, this is the advantage of having someone really focus on grief research for a long time. I've learned a lot of things, and
Mhm.
we now, I'm happy to say, we really have developed a field of grief research. I'm no longer the grief researcher, which makes me extremely happy in the sense that, I have colleagues to talk about these questions with, and we have a whole body of knowledge from much more diverse perspectives. Regardless, one of the things is that we almost always recruit participants into a study after the death has happened. That is because it is the way that we identify. But that can be from an acute death. For example, sometimes we recruit through an emergency department, right? A good friend who's an emergency department nurse does a lot of grief research by working with people who have very unexpectedly lost a loved one in an accident or a heart attack. We can also recruit through like a hospice, right? So that's been a longer time, but we tell them, look, there's a grief research study that you would be eligible for, and if you would like to share your experience, that you could be in the study. Um, we have this epidemiological research, right? These very large studies where we can look back and see, when did someone become widowed?
Mm,
That is part of how we can understand something like the broken heart phenomenon, because that married state is clear in the record. But this one study that you're talking about, it was grief specific. It was intentional that they recruited people into the study, couples, as you said, before either one was sick. The entry criteria was one of the couples was 65 years old. This was an NIH funded study, which I'm not sure will ever be done again. They then followed them for 10 years.
mm,
And when one of the couple died, they went back and re-interviewed then every few months the surviving spouse. But what's important about that is we knew a lot about how they were functioning before the death happened. And so we could figure out, is this something attributable to something that happened because of the death, or was this true before? And a great example I saw in one of the streaming questions is, of course, there are people who have depression prior to the death of a loved one.
mhm,
Well,
mhm.
this we know increases the risk of depression after the death of a loved one as well. But we see that there's this difference between people who have not had depression and experience a death and then have a new onset of depression. That looks very different than if you've been battling depression your whole life. And certainly as a clinician, that's an important distinction to make. You might intervene somewhat differently in those two circumstances. So that kind of, we call that a prospective study. It's
Mhm.
very difficult to do, but
Yeah.
it's also really important.
Yeah. Um, so throughout your book, one of the concepts that you kind of establish early and then is a central theme throughout is this idea that grief is a form of learning,
Mhm.
so neural rewiring. And many of our community members said they really hadn't thought of grief this way before your book.
Yeah.
Judy, for instance, said, I looked at grief as a process of learning to live with a loss. I
Mhm.
thought of it as an emotional, quote unquote, emotional process,
Yeah.
and presumably not a mental one. Do you think that there are other human experiences like grieving that we could all benefit from rethinking of as a form of learning?
Many of our transitions actually take us into a new part of our life where learning becomes critical, right?
Mm,
You think about, I mean, I'm surrounded by college students, right, who have left home for the first time. They're having to deal with getting 3 meals a day themselves, and also they're supposed to pay taxes, and
somehow.
so right,
Yeah.
so many things. And I think that what's useful about seeing that analogy, in both cases, these are learning processes. How do I be an adult? How do I be a widow? Right. Um, Part of what I think is so useful about thinking about it that way is that it means that this period of transition is a risky time, right? So it's not that grief is not a mental illness, right?
Mm,
But it does increase the risk for things like drug use or suicide in a way that we see other periods of transition are also a risky time for anxiety or suicidal thoughts and so forth. And so I think thinking about it that way, this person is sort of on a learning curve, and that
mm,
can go well, but that could go poorly. And hopefully, that if we support the things that might help the person to learn, giving them a chance to talk about what they're experiencing, giving them a chance to pay attention to their experience and not having to immediately be back at work and doing 12,000 things while their brain is busily actually dealing with, what's this new reality that I'm in? By supporting people in that way, I think we increase the chances that they will have that typical trajectory where they are learning what it means both to be a person who has grief, who carries the absence of this loved one now, and also how to restore a life for themselves that is meaningful, even though this person is no longer there.
yeah. We have a couple, we only have about 10 minutes left together, but we have a few more questions that I'd love to get to from our audience. Barbara mentions here, and then further down in our chat, C. Jones mentions that they're really interested in hearing this answer from you. Barbara says, in the CLOC study, there is mention that more of the widowed spouses fell into the not depressed resilient category. Maybe they wonder they experienced less depression because they were part of this long-term study. It it must be so interesting as a researcher trying to control for all of these different things. But is that something that you're thinking about as you're doing studies like this, that being part of the study might actually really be helping people get through, parts of their grief?
So this is the clock study. This is, again, incredible. People read really closely. I wish my students were as good as all of you, but this is the clock study where we followed people for the 10 years. So what's important to know is, I sometimes describe it as flavors of grieving, right? This not depressed resilient category, this sort of more chronic grief category, depressed improved, etc. The important part is they were all in the study.
Mm-hmm.
So the people in all of those flavors, all of those categories were in the study and were being followed in the same way. So it's an excellent point. And often what we realize is that especially if we're doing an intervention, right, where we're trying to help people who are grieving, it's so important to have maybe a control group who's not receiving the intervention, but also what we sometimes call a wait list control. And what that means is they're contacted, they're enrolled in the study, but then they're not contacted again during the course of the intervention, and then they're assessed again at the end. And part of the reason this is so important is people naturally learn and often improve without us doing anything. And so if an intervention is going to be useful, it has to be better than the natural course of events. And the only way as scientists that we can tell whether this intervention was statistically significant, if it actually made a difference, is to be able to compare them. So only looking at the intervention group, they're going to look better at the end of it, but are they better than they would have been if nothing had been, if there'd been no intervention?
Yeah. I really like this question from Sylvia. Does gratitude help with the grieving process?
Such a beautiful question. I think of that in a few different ways. It partly depends on gratitude for what. So one of the examples that I'm thinking of is connection with other people is so important when we're grieving. It does not take the place of the person who's died. You will still feel yearning even if you have wonderful friends and family. But gratitude we can think of as actually a practice, right? It isn't necessarily just a trait. You were born with the gratitude gene that makes you grateful for things, but we can actually think of it, right, as a practice of focusing on, paying attention to the things that we might be grateful for, in this moment, that I'm able to talk to you, through this amazing technology. The fact that Diana decided to bring this conversation to people, those are amazing things that if we don't take the time to notice and focus on them, they're likely to pass us by. And gratitude is such a comforting, restoring feeling that it can help in moments where everything feels in disarray. You feel like I can't even get this, matching socks on my feet. But I am still grateful that. So not in a denying the difficult feelings that you're having, but in addition to the difficult feelings that you're having. And so I often think about mental health is not having grief. Mental health is having grief and also joy. It is, reflecting on the loss of that person and also loving your living loved ones, right? And so gratitude, I think, can be very much a part of that.
That's amazing.
The scientific answer, just in case, is gratitude sort of falls under what we as psychologists call post-traumatic growth. And so gratitude is sort of a flavor of post-traumatic growth. And we see that people who experience post-traumatic growth have less grief. So in that empirical sense, that might be an answer too.
Yeah, it's a little less poetic, but it's all incredibly important to sort of be able to talk about both sides too. Well, Mary Frances, we're about out of time. Thank you so much. This has been such a lovely conversation, and I hope that if people haven't picked up the book yet, that they take the chance to do so. It's actually out in paperback, and so it's
Yeah.
much more accessible at libraries and your local bookstores
Yeah.
than it was a year ago when it first came out. But
Yeah.
um,
It's
if
also in audiobook for people who may have low vision, and it's available through readers as well.
yeah, someone had mentioned in the comments that they listened to it in 3 days, and so
Wow.
you have some very diligent readers here tonight. So Um, thank you so much for joining us. If people are interested in learning more about your work or about hearing about your upcoming book, hopefully coming out in the next few years, where can they learn more?
So my laboratory has a website. It's the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress Laboratory, but the web address is maryfrancesoconnor.org. So people can learn things there. And I'm on a number of the social media platforms as well.
Amazing. Yes, you are a lovely follow. So please do that. Thank you again so much. I hope that everyone had a wonderful time tonight. Again, if you want to find out more about the Science Friday Book Club, sciencefriday.com is a great place to start, but specifically sciencefriday.com/book club. We actually have a whole new web page for people to learn more. And of course, The Grieving Brain is right there on top as our current book. So thank you again, Mary Frances, for writing this book. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us for this conversation, and we will see you for the next book club. Have a
That
lovely
sounds.
night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye bye.